We're going into a crazy time because of environmental crisis, extreme weather events, meltdown of the financial system, the collapse of the established neoliberal dogmas, global trade, corporate capitalism, banks, investment, governments just sort of delivering endless economic growth through. None of that's going to be happening in the business as usual model. So we're into very uncharted waters, whether or not there's a change in science. I think that everybody knows that it's not going to be business as usual anymore. So I think our best bet is actually to look as rationally and reasonably as we can at what science can tell us. An expanded kind of science would be more open, less exclusive, less dogmatic, and I think is still our best guide, but not in a form of dogmatic materialism. I think science and reason are enormously valuable. That's why I'm a scientist, and I try to pursue science in a reasonable way. But what's often called science and reason today is neither scientific nor rational. It's an ideological belief system. And after all, the modern world isn't exactly governed by science and reason. I mean, the reasons for the fact that Britain and many other countries are still building and maintaining nuclear weapons is based on fear, which is not rational or scientific in the sense it's, these are emotions. The advertising industry is based on encouraging the 7 deadly sins, lust, avarice, envy, sloth, greed. We've got an entire sophisticated, scientifically based in psychology industry persuading people to adopt what in the past were universally regarded as vices, because those are engines of economic growth. And economic growth is destroying the planet in many ways and changing the climate. Is that rational? Well, it isn't. And attempts to look at climate change and environmental destruction scientifically and rationally, and then discuss it rationally by governments meeting in United Nations conferences, doesn't result in a rational, politically agreed solution. It results in no action at all. It results, or very little, it results in setting up more committees and agreeing to have further discussions. Meanwhile, governments are captives of a political and economic system over which they're not really in control either.
Do you think that if we do move into a new paradigm and people see that there's much more connection than we previously perhaps felt or were aware of, and that there are things greater than us, greater than the whole, and that there's much more meaning in the universe than we generally take within our culture, that this will have an impact in our behaviour, in our ethics, in our morals? Do you see us changing as a society as a result of these new perspectives if we are able to bring them on board?
I'd like to think so, but I think we've got so used to splitting ourselves that I'm not sure how much that would happen. I mean, there's a part of most modern people, which the romantic part, where they do feel a connection with the natural world, and at least with their garden and plants and their pet animals and their friends and so on, and where they're not operating in this kind of materialistic way. But we're still used to the whole public domain being given over to that economic corporate activity, profit-making and all the rest of it, which has to be changed too. We have to find new ways of creating jobs, employment, running government, industry and so forth, that are less destructive of the environment. Personal changes are relatively easy, and lots of people undergo personal changes, and they meditate or they have explorations of inner experience and that sort of thing, or they have psychotherapy, or they have religious and spiritual practices. But the public domain remains fairly unchanged. So I think the challenge is finding a new politics and a new way of ordering society. And I think that as far as people's changes are concerned, it often involves changing communities, not just individuals. And that's where I think religion has a major role to play, because one of the reasons why we have this fragmented society in the West is because of a decline of organized religion. It's now in Western Europe a very marginal part of most of social life. Used to be very important, and it's now very unimportant for most people in Britain. And it may be that that's a liberating thing. It may be that it helps in some way getting out of the bad aspects of traditional religion. But it's also isolating, and I think that if there's going to be any kind of integrative growth of a new society, there has to be some kind of spiritual or religious dimension to it, and science can't provide that.
Do you think that that many people, if they do move away from religion, do you think that there's a void there, that some new spiritual understanding could come about that isn't so dogmatic and historical, or do you think that actually our traditional beliefs are something that we should go back to?
Well, I think that we have to. I think a spiritual journey that's purely individual is the easiest thing to do, and in the modern world it's very attractive to a lot of people because it doesn't involve having to deal with the historical baggage of organized religions, Eastern or Western. And I think it's helpful, but I think the problem with it is that religion is typically something done by communities, not just individuals. And I lived in India for 7 years, and one of the things I loved about Indian culture was that when there are festivals, like these great Hindu festivals like Diwali, then there are things that everyone takes part in. The kids are there, the grown-ups are there, the old people are there. The whole community takes part in a festival. Now, we still have a residue of that in England with Christmas, where Christmas is a traditional festival which does involve most people. And even if for many people the religious focus is not the central one, many of the themes of it being a collectively enjoyed festival are there. I think we need festivals. I think we need sacred places. I think we need pilgrimages and things like that, which are all part of traditional religious practice. Hindus have pilgrimages, Muslims have them. After all, the Hajj to Mecca is the biggest in the world of pilgrimages. And in England, in the Middle Ages, there were lots of pilgrimages. Canterbury was one of the great centres, and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was, after all, set on a pilgrim journey. There are still pilgrimage places in England, and there are plenty in continental Europe, and there are some wonderful ones in Ireland. So I think that these are things, recovering a sense of sacred place, sacred festivals, collective celebration, are more to do with religion than an entirely individualized pick-and-mix spirituality, which, if people have a bit of Native American here mixed in with a bit of Buddhism and, a few crystals and that kind of thing, you can make your own kind of salad, a spiritual salad, and it fits with this very Western obsession with free choice and individualism. But it doesn't have this collective dimension, which I think we need as well, because we're social animals and we need to express our spiritual lives not just individually but in community, and we need to have something in which children can grow up and feel part of a larger community. So I do think in all cultures the traditions are very important, and one of the things that makes other cultures attractive to us is the fact that they do have collective celebrations and shared experiences and traditions that they follow. If one went, probably in a few years' time, when you visit tribal cultures, they'll have lost them, and they'll all be playing video games on handheld devices and linked up to the internet through smartphones and so on, and part of the same world we're in here. Is that an advance? Some might think so, but it will make them much less interesting to us, because the very thing we appreciate in them are the things that we've lost ourselves. And if they lose them too, then I think we'll be much less interested in them. So I think what other cultures have to offer us, and what's so attractive about them, is this tradition, this integration of individuals with a community and with the ancestors and with tradition. And I think we need to recover that ourselves.
Would you be interested in a recovery of something like that goes all the way back, perhaps, before Christianity, before paganism back. Do you think that there's still enough that we could pull out of the ashes of some of our oldest traditions and have them as unifying ways of coming together as community?
Well, I think that the oldest traditions probably had, which in a way we still have, are seasonal festivals. I mean, if we look at the megalithic monuments of Europe, Newgrange in Ireland, which is lit up on the winter solstice, and something like West Kennet Longbarrow in Wiltshire, which is similar to Newgrange. This is 3,500 BC. This is one of the oldest buildings in Britain. I mean, of course, humans go back hundreds of thousands of years, and people were doing paintings in caves 30,000 years ago. But thinking of Britain, which is where we are now, 3,500 BC, that's aligned on the equinox. So the light at the day when the spring and autumn equinoxes, the light shines into that chambered tomb. So it's clear that these traditional societies were ordering their society in accordance with the seasons of the year. This is pretty basic. And I think that the seasonal festivals they were Christianized. The ancient seasonal festivals in Europe were taken over and incorporated into Christian seasonal festivals. So I think the way in which most of them survive today is in their Christianized form. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a cultural integration. And most of what we see in traditional Christianity is based on pre-Christian roots. It's integrated them. So I don't see it as we're stripping away the whole of 2,000 years of Christian tradition and somehow trying to go back to some purer, earth-based religion. I see it's better to build. It's been an accretive growth, a growth and integration over a long period, and I think it's better to continue with an evolutionary process that integrates rather than trying to get back to some kind of megalithic fundamentalism, because we know so little about it anyway. Yes. That we'd be totally at the mercy of rival schools of archaeologists who all have different theories as to what these ancient monuments or cave paintings were all about.
Have you had moments in your own life that have given you strong sensations of things that are paranormal, non-scientific, connections to the universe, or whatever, all of these things that we generally rationally dismiss? Have you had your own very strong experiences like that?
I have, yes. I mean, I've had quite a few experiences where I felt that I'm part of something much greater than myself, that my mind's part of a much greater conscious being or beings. I think these are common. I don't think I'm particularly special in that respect. I think many people have them. In our culture, there's a taboo against talking about them. As a child, I had a very strong sense of connection with the natural world and with animals. I kept a lot of pets, and I was really into plants and animals. That's why I became a biologist. I've had experiences, when I've been meditating, that a sense of being connected to something much greater than myself. Senses when I've been in the natural world, in beautiful settings with flowers, in gardens, in woods, in mountains, which again I think many people have, a sense of connection with a much greater reality than my own rather petty personal concerns. I have had various experiences of altered states of consciousness. I have experiences of beauty, transcendent beauty. I mean, for me, one of the most beautiful, almost predictably beautiful experiences in England is going to choral evensong in one of our great cathedrals, where almost every day they have this choir singing sublimely beautiful music in these magnificent Gothic structures or Norman structures that have been there for hundreds of years, resonating to sacred music, and you hear this music echoing around the cathedral. So, yes, I think that almost anyone probably has experiences of a world and conscious realms greater than themselves. And if they don't, I think they're probably leading a very impoverished life. But lots of people get this through direct experience, through art, through music, through dancing together, through religious ceremony and ritual, through sacred places, through mountains, through woods, through making love, through personal experiences that take us beyond our normal routines. So I think this is what makes life worth living, and it's what makes life worth living for most people, whatever their religious beliefs or scientific beliefs. But I think it's possible to lead a more integrated life where these experiences are integrated with one's intellectual understanding rather than being in completely separate compartments. And I think it's probably healthier to find a more integrated way of living, personally and collectively.
I've been very privileged to have been in positions where I've been right next to all sorts of extraordinary activities, shamans speaking in tongues and reaching altered states and all sorts of stuff. And by and large, I was actually not open to it and didn't feel much at all. I was one of those impoverished people, Rupert, and I really was. I mean, I was sympathetic and I was respectful, but I was very closed. And it was only actually later that I allowed myself, through the intellect, to open, that I was able to feel all these other sensations that came flooding in with joy. What was holding me back from having those experiences first?
I think all of us are held back by some reasonable level of fear. I mean, if we're open to everything, we'd be swept along in all sorts of chaotic directions. And there are a lot of things I don't particularly want to be open to. I mean, I don't want to be open to the experience of heroin addiction, for example. I think it's reasonable to be fearful of certain destructive kinds of addiction, even though I dare say there's a pleasure to it. People do it because there's an overwhelming momentary pleasure involved. But so I don't think being open to everything is a virtue necessarily. I think that being excessively fearful on the basis of an intellectual theory is probably an inhibiting and constricting thing. And I think, dogma and prejudice shape us all, and we have to become aware of what holds us back. I find myself, one of the things I was closed about was the Christian tradition. I mean, I became a scientific atheist when I was at school and at university, because that was part of the package deal. If you become a scientist, you become a materialist, you become an atheist, you sneer at every kind of religious tradition on the grounds you're smarter than them. Here are all these stupid people believing all these dogmas, and I've risen above it. I mean, the bonus for atheists is feeling that you're smart. I thought that was great, for a while. And then I realized actually this was rather a shallow position, and it was cutting me off from things. When I traveled for the first time in Asia, in India, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, I traveled there in the 1960s and found cultures of people who seemed to me very sophisticated and smart, not stupid, not contemptibly corrupt or bogged down in superstition, but with highly sophisticated views of the world, Buddhist monks, Hindu meditators, sadhus, who seemed to have a much bigger grasp of reality than anything I'd come across. That really opened my mind up. But I still retained a prejudice against Christianity, which is the standard default Enlightenment position of educated people in the West. It wasn't till many years later, when I was living in India, that I found a way of coming to terms with the Christian tradition, which I'd got a great prejudice against. It wasn't exactly fear, it was a kind of just a deep prejudice that I'd inherited from this kind of Enlightenment rationalist propaganda, which has been a standard part of Western education for 200 years, implicitly at least. So I think it's not just fear, it's taboos and it's dogmas and it's prejudices. And we're all going to end up with taboos, dogmas and prejudices. It's probably impossible to be free of them all, but some are more harmful and restrictive than others. And so I think through travelling, through exploration, through talking to others and through experience, we can become more open. But in a way, we have to find a path that we can follow, and we can't go on endlessly being open to everything because, it's limitless. One has to find a way of living. And that's the challenge, to be open enough to find things that contribute to a way of living in a more harmonious way, but not making exploration a full-time job, because one has to get on with the rest of one's life too.
Sure. Although what you say resonates very deeply with me, I think that I still have a bit of my own shadow, is my Christian background. I was very Christian when I was younger, and I enjoyed it, and I expressed a belief. I was almost evangelical at times, and then I went into the period of my life of deep questioning, and I realised there's many things about it that didn't fit for me, and then I, having also experienced other cultures and other traditions, I saw that there was a vast array of stuff that was as wonderful, it seemed to me, and yet I still kept a little bit of a dark perspective of my own background, perhaps a bit of fear, perhaps a bit of definitely prejudice, perhaps a bit of embarrassment of having been there once or something. And I think I've still got to deal with that, and that I shouldn't turn my back on it. I need to incorporate it, perhaps.
Yes, it's very similar. I mean, I think for me, the what was important was, because I did reject the Christian tradition, and then I was in India. I was doing yoga and meditation and visiting temples and going to pilgrimage places and listening to gurus, and gained and learned a huge amount from that. And I still do yoga on a daily basis, and I meditate. So I didn't see it as either or. I saw it as both and. I mean, if you do yoga, and it doesn't mean to say you can't go to choral evensong in a cathedral, and nor would any Hindu expect that. I mean, most Hindus have a very inclusive view of religion. They're prepared to embrace all forms of spirituality.
Yes, yeah.
It's a very inclusive, not exclusive approach to religion, which I think we've got a lot to learn from. So I don't see it as either or, and I don't see personal spiritual experience as being somehow contrary to collective participation in collective religion, like services and festivals. I see it as completely complementary. I don't see that it's either or.